Hello and welcome to part 1 of the new TCS guide. For those unfamiliar, TCS is a nation RP game based on Discord and Google Sheets that simulates a global economy as well as diplomacy, military warfare, and plenty of other things. If that at all sounds interesting to you, you can check the description. All details on how to join will be down there. But this is just simply a guide that the server has been lacking for a long time. To be very clear, however, I am not running off of a script. I don't have time to write out a script and get this done, although I am trying to get all the videos in this guide done before the end of the day. If you notice in editing that there are parts cut out, that is likely just due to me either being slow with it and redoing it, or simply going on a tangent that isn't relevant to what you need to get going on TCS. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments, or simply go to the Discord and someone will help you. Without further ado, let's get straight into it. To start with, we're going to the budget tab, because this is where 99% of your gameplay on TCS will be when not in the Discord. Effectively, you manage your federal budget, obviously. You manage your taxation. And you can come over here and you can see all your sources of income and expenditures. It's a very useful tab for many reasons, but it is your main interaction with the game. To interact with something, you can interact with any of these off-white cells for your row, for your nation's row. So if I was the US, I could change my taxation to 25% on the lower class, lose a ton of money in the budget, but gain growth. The only exception to this rule is right here, the defense personnel readiness in nuclear. This is connected to a formula and is a protected range, and this formula simply factors in the amount of money you spend in the recruiting tab itself. So if you want to alter this, change your recruiting, or you can change your readiness in the military production tab, or the amount you spend on weapons of mass destruction. That is unnecessary at the moment. Just if you need help zeroing that out because you're new to the game, feel free to ask somebody, but it's usually not the biggest part of the budget, although when we're in wartime, as you can see, it becomes quite large. You'll notice espionage looks like it's completely empty for everybody. It is not. The numbers are just simply hidden because they're the same color as the cell. So you can see here, you've got a budget in there, but it's hidden so that people can't try and base their espionage budgets upon each other's. As for taxation, you have the three main types of tax: lower class, middle class, and upper class. This simply taxes a portion of your population based on these facts. I would say, right now, it is very clearly leaning in favour of taxing the lower class. That is simply due to the tax system needing a redevelopment in TCS. So don't take for granted that this will always be the case. Just for now, know that lower class is by far the best tax. It gives you the most money at the least negative effect. Energy company tax is exactly what it says. There's an energy company tab down here, and you just take a portion of their income based on your tax rate in here. Stock tax, also similar to what it says. You take a percentage of the growth in your stock market. So if you increase this to 50% for the US, they now go down to 2% growth, and you get 2 billion in taxation, whereas you were getting 1.5 billion and 4% growth. They all go about saying you just tinker with them until they're what you want them to be, and they give you, like I say, more money in your federal budget, which increases your surplus, or if you lower them, you get less money, and the higher spending, the lower budget combined with your already high spending creates more growth. So if you're prioritizing growth but going into debt, that is something you can decide to do in the game. This government type part is purely RP based. Half the time it's not even up to date with what's accurate in the game. So I just ignore it. If you wanted to change yours so it matches, you simply go to the government tab over here, and you could say the ruling party and what brand. So you could say it's an absolute monarchy in the US, and it's that. Realistically, it doesn't matter, because unless it's represented on the Discord, it is irrelevant. Now, for interacting with your budget in general, this is as simple as just changing the value in dollars, and it affects your surplus, it affects the growth rate, and it affects other parts of the sheet. And over here, looking at income, you can simply see the amount of income you are making from each of these factors. There is one case where this isn't going into your federal budget, and that is the stock exchange. That instead goes into your emergency monetary reserve, which you can think of as like your treasury, and I'll get more into that in a few videos when we cover managing your finances as a nation. As for the expenses, the same is true for the stock exchange. If you're losing money, it comes out of your EMR. The rest of it just affects the amount of federal budget you have. It's not reflected in your surplus deficit, it is just this number, the original budget, will get lower or higher based upon those numbers over there, which indirectly will affect your surplus. Whereas these, they don't take away from your federal budget, no matter how much you put into them, they just make it more of a deficit. So minor difference, but it can play a big role if you want to get really into the nitty-gritty with how to manage your budget. Anyway, I believe that's all the basics for the budget tab. We'll come back here throughout the series to interact with different tabs. For example, when we're managing Social Security and Healthcare, we'll come back to here. When we're managing your energy resources, we'll come back to these two. When we're managing your infrastructure, you'll come back to these two. When you're managing your military, you'll come back to these two. And yeah, so it's like the central hub of how TCS works. So yeah, let's continue on with the next part. As you can see for this part of the video, we've headed over to the Errors tab at the far left of the sheet. This is almost always at the far left of the sheet, unless someone has mistakenly moved it like that. Essentially, the Errors tab is just a big tab that, one, lets us manage information about the nations as an admin. So most of this information is irrelevant to you. Like whether you're on player or AI simply affects if you take the effects of your budget or not. So if you are on AI, obviously get an admin to change that fact. Continent and region is literally just an experimental thing that never got fully pursued. And I don't even think it's up to date on some nations. If we scroll down, we'll probably see a few where it's inaccurate. For example, Paraguay being in Asia, and Morocco being in North America. But it's completely irrelevant, so it's not kept up to date, and you can ignore these for the most part, unless you just really are desperate for it to, for some reason, be accurate. Now on this side, this is the only part of the sheet that truly matters to you in this tab, and that is your errors. So you can see a count of how many errors you have. That is usually not used because, as you can see 5 errors, you can use your brain. However, if you have more than 5 errors, then this is useful because you'll know that there's more to come even beyond these 5 slots. Errors can come in a variety of different reasons. For example, here we have more soldiers than law allows. That means France has not got a conscription policy that allows them to recruit as many soldiers as they have. Negative education budget just means they're not funding their education system enough for how much they're trying to spend in it. And illegal amounts of investment received just simply means they are receiving more foreign investment than they are legally allowed. By the rules of the sheet, not by any international law in RP. Social Security bankrupt is another one. Negative rail capacity. These are all, obviously, you only have to focus on your own, and these are all going to be confusing if you don't already know what these mean. So, just when we go through the series, you will see parts that this might link to. For example, when we do the infrastructure tab, you might see what I mean by you can have a negative infrastructure budget. Uh, and then you'll be able to interpret it yourself quite easily. And if you cannot, you can always just ask. People will respond in usually about 5 minutes. If you ping somebody who's already online, which there almost always is. So this is just me telling you to make sure to keep track of this, because if you have errors at a year change, which is every 4 days in peacetime and an undisclosed amount of time in wartime, which we're currently in wartime, but if a year change is upcoming, you need to have these fixed before it happens. If not, as the year changer, I would go in and fix these in however the fastest way possible is, regardless of its negative consequences. So, for example, more soldiers than the law allows, I would simply increase your law, which if you're trying to avoid getting the dissent from that law, it might be better for you to take away the soldiers. For the education budget, I simply just fulfill the education... No, I just simply lower the education spending, lowering your effect from education, which is a negative, whereas you might think it's better to increase your budget so that you can afford to spend that much on education. That might not make much sense right now, but essentially, if you leave your errors undone, they will be fixed, but not in the most optimal way, in the fastest way, which often leads to bad effects from it. I think that's all for the errors tab. Like I say, if you're not on player, inform an admin, we can get you on player. And yeah, that's about all the interaction you need with this tab. Now we'll be moving on to assessing the situation of your nation. Say you just inherited, let's pick a nation real quick. You've just inherited the nation of Mexico. A previous player has quit it, you're now the player for Mexico. So this is how you can just generally see how screwed up you are, how okay you are, all that information. And this is like what I would do if I just took over a nation. So to start with, we can just simply see the budget and your surplus deficit. If you're running a positive or close to positive like this is, that's usually a pretty good sign. And you can see the total amount your budget is. So, for example, if Liberia is in deficit of 35 million, that's going to be a much bigger deal than if Mexico is with a 500 million budget. See Montenegro, they have a very small deficit for most people. However, they only have 435,000 in their budget, so it becomes an issue. After that, I'd look at the growth. This just simply means how much their economy is growing in a year. It's also visible in other tabs, such as the economic overview tab. And it's just a good sign of how okay you are this year. You can look at the specific budget elements and the taxation, if you like. It's just all I'm going to tell you information about how the last player played. I would always come to look at the income, find out where you're making most of your money. For example, half the Mexican budget comes from taxes. Near another half comes from foreign aid, which means that it's an unreliable source, because if you ever go against whoever giving you that foreign aid, my bet would be it's probably America, then you're going to lose half of your budget. So if we go over to foreign aid, and we look for Mexico, so we look at the top for Mexico, they're getting 212 million from the side, which is the United States. That is half of their budget, impacted by the US, and would be seen as a bit of a red flag that you would want to probably seek to move away from, or you can simply double down on it and become a near US puppet state if you'd like. When it comes to expenditures, these are usually pretty self-explanatory. I'd only intervene in these if there is a massive problem, like if you're spending billions on gold buying, you've got a problem because nobody spends billions on gold buying, so you should reduce your gold buying. But yeah, so that's about all the information you can glean from the budget tab. If we move over to the economic overview, like I just mentioned, we can go down here and we can see the current Mexican GDP is 1.1 billion. If we compare this to other regional competitors, such as Brazil, they're at 1 billion. We can look for maybe Argentina, if they're at 827 million. And then we can scroll up and we can compare it to Canada, who's at 1 billion, and the US, who's at 24 billion. So the US is always going to be above us here. We're going to accept that never in this season can we really expect to overtake the US unless something catastrophic happens and the US dies, the US ceases to exist. It is near impossible that Mexico will ever compete at that level, or alternatively, Mexico could pursue nation unions or annexation of other nations or any number of other things to try and match that GDP. I'm not saying it's impossible, I'm just saying it's very implausible, and you would have to be one of the most skilled players in TCS to ever have that power shift. Now, importantly, as Mexico in this position, my priority would be staying above this Brazilian GDP, because they are probably your largest competitor for the regional economy. Staying above this Argentinian one, although you've got a little bit longer to do that, because they are further away. And you can see how close those nations are coming by looking here. You can see they're currently negatively growing, or shrinking, Brazil. So we don't need to worry about them as much. Argentina is growing, but they're nowhere near growing as fast as we are. So we can see this as we are fine compared to our regional competitors. We can also look at these numbers, your GDP next year and your GDP in 1907. So if we look here, Mexico will be at 1.969. Brazil is actually on track to overtake us by 1907. This is based on averages, based on their previous few years. And so I would take it with a grain of salt, as we can currently see Brazil is not growing at the same rate it has been the past few years. We can scroll down here if we want to see what rate it was. So we can scroll all the way down to Brazil. Where is Brazil? There. We can see they've had 7%, 7%, 5%, 5%, 5%, 3%, 7%, 6%, and then 18% for 1 year. And so that will be highly increasing their average, and so that will be much higher than it truly will be. Mexico, on the other hand, if we scroll down to Mexico, we can see our growth. We went 6%, 3 to 4%, 7%, 1% 1 year, which is quite bad. 2.5% another year, still quite bad. But then we came back a bit. We got 4%, we got 6%, we got 10.85, 9.98, and we're currently in a bit of an economic, a bit of a prosperous period in our economics. It's been pretty stagnant. Well, not stagnant. These are still pretty good numbers, 6 and 7%. But then it just like jumps up here for a little while, and if that can be maintained, that is optimal. Continuing on, you can see information like your GDP per capita. This is just how much GDP you have for every person in your population you have. Doesn't affect a huge amount, but it does affect some things quite heavily, such as your workers' expected wages and what have you. So, I mean, I'd usually just let your GDP per capita be whatever it can be, ideally high, but that's just going to cost you more money to function as a nation. So try and keep your GDP and your population growing as high as you can at all times, essentially, would be the optimal way of doing it. I'd ignore national purchasing power. It's pretty irrelevant in near enough everything. I would, however, look at your total national debt, and more importantly, these debt to GDP numbers, these percentages here. You've got 4 of them, 2 of them that are important. So Mexico has 2.69% debt to GDP. That means the value of their national debt that is held externally, which means another nation has funded it, essentially, has bought the rights to that debt, and as such, you're paying that other nation interest. So 30 million, or 2.69%, is by no means a bad number. That is actually pretty good. 8% is starting to show very high growth of debt, so you'd want to watch it. And internal debt here, they've got 0%. This just means any internal debt you have, like we can see Argentina has a lot of internal debt, will cost 1.5 times the interest that you pay on external debt. That'll make more sense when we get to the debt tab video in a few videos, but that's just the information. Then you've got total debt to GDP here, which for Mexico is the same as their external debt. And yeah, so having no debt is obviously the best case. However, that could also mean that you've been underspending, because sometimes it's a good idea to go into debt to manage to outpace another nation in a certain field. I'd ignore unindebted growth. It ain't that important. Economic expansion since 1890 shows generally how good you've been going since 1890, since the season started. Mexico is actually the worst of the two competitors I've given them in this regard. But they do actually beat the United States in terms of their percentage economic expansion. Obviously, in actual growth, the USA easily beats Mexico here. And then you have your average wage and your average salary. These are based upon your GDP per capita, and they're just information that you can use to compare yourself with other nations, or you can use it to determine how much wages to give your workers and soldiers. For example, stock market. I mean, a high-valued stock market is always a good thing. If it's extremely low compared to its competitors, I'd be worried. It's actually quite high compared to its competitors. So I'd see that as Mexico hasn't been overtaxing the stock market. It is pretty good condition. Not that is a massive deal in most cases. Now we'll move over to the government tab to further look at our nation's situation. So we go to the government tab and we see. So the ideology and ruling party was already covered earlier in the video. This is irrelevant. I mean, it could be accurate. So Mexico hasn't got anything in there. But if you've taken over Argentina, you can see what the current situation is. But people, like I say, don't keep this up to date, so I'd much prefer to look at the RP that's already been done by the Mexico player to see where I stand as a government and as what party's in power. Next, we have this, stability. This is a pretty big factor in TCS. If this hits 0, you go into a civil war or a coup, or the GMs decide essentially, and your nation collapses. And this can be affected in numerous ways. First way would be on-sheet issues. You can see here, you're gaining 4% stability from crime. You're losing stability from not fulfilling your nation's basic needs. This could be not fulfilling resources, not fulfilling food, or something along those lines. You can see conflict has an effect. So Austria being at war has a negative 10% effect. The Ottomans, however, being in a defensive war, have a negative 6% effect. We're coming up on a near world war situation here, so you can see a lot of nations are involved in this negative effect. But Mexico is not at war, at least yet, so yeah. So interest rate. I just looked into this because I wasn't sure how it works, and by the looks of it, it's an inactive system. It is irrelevant in essentially anything that you do, so I just ignore it. There will be an announcement or something if this ever actually starts to work. Outstanding debt. This is the negative effect you have from having outstanding debt. This is debt that hasn't been put into your internal debt, which is essentially your own companies are funding your projects, your debt, your budget, and it hasn't been claimed by another nation, which is the external debt we spoke about prior. If we go down to Mexico, they have actually got outstanding debt, and the percentage comparison to GDP that we used earlier is exactly what determines its effect on stability. And then pensions, this is just if you're not fulfilling your pensions, or if you are fulfilling your pensions, you get an effect, which will be covered in the social liabilities video covering domestic affairs. So if we go down here, we can see Brazil is actually going down in stability. It's almost halfway. It's almost at half, like, maximum stability. Argentina is lower in stability, but it'll be back at 100% next year. We are at 100%, and we're not showing any signs of going down. The overall change is positive, and this initiative in education is the effect that your education system has on it, coupled with the effect that initiatives have on it, which initiatives are something that will be got into very late into this series. They're very useful, but they're not highly important to get going. If we move over here, we can see the policies your nations have. We're not going to get into detail with these and what they do until the video that covers them. However, you can see things like whether or not immigration is free, which right now Mexico isn't allowing immigration. They're not allowing emigration either. I'd actually say, in my opinion, I would allow immigration, and I would disallow emigration, but not fully. I'd just discriminate against it. This is because these policies, you are required to make them somewhat reflective of your RP state. For example, a nation such as Mexico in this time period probably wouldn't have single-payer healthcare in 1897. In fact, I don't think any nation realistically has single-payer healthcare at this time period. You can see Dutch East Indies have, but they're an AI nation, so we don't really keep them up to date because it's completely ineffective of anything. So keep these realistic, keep these up to date with RP, and reap the benefits of them. But yeah, having high immigration increases population growth, which is almost always a positive thing in TCS. And other things I'd look at would be to see food consumption. Conservative, that just means we've got enough food. It's not like we're overdoing it. I don't know why Mexico's on rationing. That is something that would be a bit of a red flag to me. I'd be trying to get off that as fast as possible. Which it could either involve importing food from other nations or producing more food. And conscription, as long as this isn't too high, which this is a second down. If we're scraping the barrel at peacetime, I'd be cutting off military funding quite heavily. But yeah, so that's what we can see from this tab, and then this just shows you the effects that your policies have. More on that in the video covering this tab. Now we're going to move over to the population tab. Here we can just see our population growth, which we want to be a positive. It is. It's not as high as Brazil. It's not as high as Argentina. It's higher than the US. Oh no, it's not higher. It is higher than the US. Sorry, my apologies. We can see our current population, the population next year, how dense our population is by square miles, what percent you are of the world population. Most of this is irrelevant, apart from what the total population is. You can see specifically how many deaths, births, immigrants, how much it's being affected by your initiatives and your laws, which we've just seen in the government policies tab. And then this is where we're coming to look at. This is your dissent. This is effectively stability, but flipped around. This is how much your so stability is how much your government is unstable, how many problems they have, how likely they are to be toppled. Dissent is how pissed off your civilian population is, how much they are ready to riot, how much they are ready to rebel. At 10%, this isn't a big deal. 100%, it's a total collapse of your nation. There are no player nations on 100% to my knowledge. If they had, they'd be collapsed by GMs who write out an RP situation regarding the collapse, and then you can respond to it as the player, becoming the new government. Importantly, you don't continue to play as the old government. You play as your nation, everybody inside of it, and all factions within it. In like 9 times out of 10 in TCS, you don't play rebellions. You play as whatever the current standing nation's government is. Over here you can see the percentage of your classes, not usually that relevant in general. You can see the age of your population, which actually factors in the size of your workforce, how many children you have, how many retired you have, how many soldiers you have, and how many women you have who aren't able to work due to your women in the workforce policy in the government tab. And then here you can see specifically what is impacting your dissent right now. Laws in the education system are doing a great job at keeping it down. Are we growing or shrinking? We're growing. No, we're shrinking overall in dissent. And then our main problem is that we have an initiative which intentionally gives us dissent, which is just essentially they've done that as a means of having more points in their initiative, which might not make sense right now, but essentially it makes an initiative more effective at the cost of something. Outside of that, I'd look at the military production tab just generally, and I'd have a look at what our total military industry is and compare it to our regional competitors. So Argentina has a larger military than us. I'd try and overtake that. So does Brazil. So I'd prioritize growth of the military. In Mexico's position, I would also probably be against this heavy growth from these nations. A standard peacetime growth in TCS is usually around 5%. Obviously, for most nations, it isn't peacetime up here, but in South America, it is pretty peaceful outside of Brazil threatening a war with Bolivia, but that wouldn't require this heavy growth, even if it was supported by most nations. So yeah, that is something to factor in. Compare it to your regional rivals. This just affects how many ships you can have, how much equipment you can use in your army, and everything. Manage your growth percentage. I would keep it around 5 to 10% in peacetime. If you're desperate to overtake someone, you can increase it beyond that. And if it's wartime, you can go to the moon and back with it. For all I care, it's time for war. You don't care what consequences are. Although obviously I'd still be reasonable in that case. Military industry GDP. This is what percent of your GDP, as mentioned earlier in the economic overview tab, is military industry value. Essentially, the higher this is, the more negative consequences that the military has on your GDP growth, your ability to grow your nation. This is a tiny military industry to GDP. This is a more reasonable one, around 1%, that both of these nations have. If we go up here, you can see at wartime, these nations don't have no chill with their industry GDP. As you can see, America's more in our footsteps because they're not involved in the war. So yeah, that's all I'd look at. You can manage the rest of the military once we get to the military video. And yeah, I believe that is all the information you really need to quickly judge how screwed up you are. Which I'd say Mexico is in a pretty good position right now. It's got some major problems, which is their rationing. I wouldn't want to be rationing food out in peacetime, because then what do you do in wartime? Their reliance on US funds to survive. I mean, half of their budget is it. If the US wanted, they could put a stop to any Mexican economic growth with just a flick of their fingers, and Mexico is powerless to do anything against it. And other than that, I think they're mostly okay. So that is how I would evaluate a nation. And yeah, I hope that this video has been informative. I know it hasn't covered really much of how to play TCS. It's just been a sort of example of what your first look at the sheet might be. You see the budget tab, how to use it. You see your nation and how much you have, how much work you've got ahead of you. And yeah, we'll go into how to fix it in the next few videos. First, the next video will actually be on the military, managing your military, your recruitment and military industry, because I know half the time that is what a new player wants to get into straight away. And then after that, we'll get into the how to manage your economics much more. So yeah, thank you for watching. Good luck on your TCS journey, and I'll see you in the next one.